material has revealed the oldest complete genome ever sequenced from an ancient Egyptian. The results of the study revealed unexpected ancestry, labor, and cultural connections, as well as the origins of one
race. They point to descriptions of a group of divine beings called the Anunnaki, the so-called princely offspring of God, who, according to the Sumerians, descended from the sky. That there is a hidden code within our DNA, one that contains precise mathematical patterns and an unknown symbolic language.
What if the oldest city on Earth was never truly local? Not ancient, not mysterious, local. That is the assumption we almost never question. We point at river valleys on a map, draw neat arrows in textbooks, and tell ourselves civilization rose from mud, grain, and patient human hands as naturally as reeds along a riverbank. But then a sealed burial jar is opened, a tooth is sampled, a genome is teased out of dust older than empires, and suddenly the cradle of civilization begins to look less like cradle and more like a landing site for something history misunderstood from the start. Picture the first cities not as ruins but as noise. Hammer on clay, donkeys braying in alleys, wet brick baking under a white-hot sun, fish scales glinting in woven baskets, smoke drifting from kilns, ink-dark marshes breathing at the edge of the plain. In that world, Uruk rose like a challenge thrown at nature itself, with walls, scribes, temples, and ledgers so old they seem to stand at the edge of memory. This was where many scholars place the first true urban civilization. The first bureaucracy, the first great experiment in turning strangers into a system. And that is where the trouble begins. Because when archaeogeneticists finally get what earlier generations only dreamed of, a viable sequence from human remains tied to the earliest urban horizon, the result is supposed to be reassuring. A missing confirmation, a tidy line joining the people, the place, and the culture. The story should click into place. These are the ancestors of the city builders. These are the locals who domesticated the rivers, organized labor, and invented history before history knew its own name. Instead, the data comes back wrong. At first, wrong in the boring way. Contamination checks, replication runs, controls, sequencing errors, lab error, modern handlers. Every ancient DNA team knows the ghosts that can sneak into a sample. So they clean, rerun, compare damage patterns, map fragment lengths, test for modern intrusion, and rebuild the genome again like a shattered mirror being assembled one silver shard at a time. The numbers settle, the statistical noise shrinks, the confidence grows, and the strangeness remains. The individual buried near the cultural heartland of the earliest civilization does not look, genetically speaking, like a population that simply emerged in place and stayed there. A significant part of the ancestry points elsewhere. Not a village over, not a nearby hill country in the simple way people expected, elsewhere in a deeper sense, a signal from beyond the home terrain. A pattern that suggests the makers of the first cities were not born from one soil, one tribe, one valley, one uninterrupted line of local continuity. They were arrivals, composites, people with one foot in the plane and the other in a vanished world. Now, if you're hearing the title in your head and expecting Silver Spacecraft or Sumer, hold that thought. Because the first twist is colder and stranger than aliens. Not from here may not mean not from Earth. It may mean not from the Earth that still exists. That possibility begins, oddly enough, with water. The Persian Gulf today is a shallow inland sea. During the last ice age and the long thaw that followed, coastlines shifted like living things. Land that once lay open was swallowed. River systems changed course, marshes expanded, estuaries formed, entire habitable landscapes disappeared under rising water, leaving no standing walls for archaeologists to admire and no obvious monument to remind later people what had been lost. A homeland can vanish without a dramatic ending, and it can simply drown meter by meter, generation by generation, until it becomes myth. Imagine a broad, fertile basin where rivers braided across rich sediment before the Gulf filled to its current shape, not paradise. Something more believable: mudflats, fisheries, grazing lands, reed settlements, tidal channels, trade routes stitched together by boat, a place where people learn to navigate water, long before roads mattered, a place where cooperation was not philosophical but necessary. Store grain together or starve, track exchange or lose everything, build platforms above flood levels or watch each season erase your life. Now imagine the sea begins to rise, not in one apocalyptic afternoon, slowly, cruelly, fast enough to be noticed within a lifetime, slow enough to be denied by every elder who remembered drier years. Wells turn brackish, burial grounds slip under mud, familiar shorelines retreat. Villages move inland and then move again. Families carry seeds, stories, rituals, and practical mathematics from one shrinking refuge to the next. They are not just refugees, they are experts in surviving unstable water. So when later alluvial Mesopotamia becomes the stage for the first cities, who has the knowledge to master floodplain chaos? Who knows boats, storage, canals, seasonal uncertainty, collective labor, and the delicate social art of making many communities function as one, not necessarily isolated farmers from one local patch of dirt. The best candidates might be people displaced from the drowned basin below, and suddenly the genetic anomaly starts to read like a memory. You can feel the script of history trying to resist that. We love clean origins. We love saying civilization was invented here by these people at this date in this sequence, as if reality ever cared about our diagrams. But the DNA suggests an uglier, richer truth. The first civilization may not have been founded by pure natives of a single region. It may have been built by converging populations carrying different ancestries, different adaptations, and different habits of survival into one stressed landscape. The city was not a seed, it was a collision. That changes everything. Because once you stop imagining the first civilization as a lonely miracle and start seeing it as a pressure chamber for migrants, traders, marsh peoples, upland foragers, ritual specialists, and displaced coastal communities, the inventions of urban life stop looking sudden. Writing no longer feels like magic dropped from the sky. It feels like what happens when too many goods, obligations, names, debts, and offerings are moving through too many hands for memory alone to manage. Monumental temples stop being mere religious exuberance. They become social anchors for unstable populations. Bureaucracy stops sounding dull and starts sounding like emergency engineering for human complexity. And here comes the second twist. The DNA does not merely question where the founders came from. It questions what a civilization is. We are taught to think civilizations are born from identity first and administration second, a people then a city, a culture then a state. But what if it happened the other way around? What if the city came first as a machine for compressing diversity into order? What if Sumerian or any identity we pin to the earliest cities was not an ancient bloodline expressing itself at last, but a civic invention strong enough to weld strangers into a single destiny? In that version, the first civilization was not built by one people. It built a people. That is a much weirder idea than aliens, because it means the earliest urban revolution may have begun not with belonging, but with displacement, not with sameness, but with friction, not with purity, but with mixture. The genome, instead of revealing some hidden master race of founders, points toward a biological mosaic. And mosaics are not accidents. They are constructed, piece by piece, choice by choice, marriage by marriage, trade by trade, crisis by crisis. Think about what that would have felt like on the ground. You wake in a city where 5 dialects scrape against one another in the market. The man unloading bitumen speaks with the rhythm of marsh country. The woman tallying grain learned numbers from a father whose people came from stony northern slopes. The temple singer performs a hymn older than the city itself, a hymn carried inland from a shoreline that no longer exists. Children grow up hearing stories of lost water, lost islands, drowned reeds, old channels where fish once ran silver in the dusk. They belong to the city, yes, but beneath the city is an ache, a memory of elsewhere. That may be why the myths of early Mesopotamia feel haunted by waters, by origins, by kingship descending, by ordered space wrestled from chaos. We often read these stories symbolically, and of course they are symbolic, but symbols usually have bones under them. A flood story becomes powerful because flood is not abstract. A paradise by rivers becomes sacred because some ancestral landscape was once so life-giving that its disappearance scarred memory. A city's god becomes supreme because centralized ritual is one of the few tools capable of unifying people who did not begin as one people. Then the lab finds something even more unsettling. The individual at the center of the analysis is not an outlier in the trivial sense. Isotopic signatures, burial treatment, associated material culture, and the broader archaeological context place him inside the society, not outside it. He was not an exotic tourist, not an accidental foreigner passing through. The elsewhere in his DNA was already woven into the fabric of the civilization itself. The anomaly was normal. The foreignness was foundational. Read that again in your mind. The foreignness was foundational. This is the moment where common knowledge quietly collapses because we still carry a childish image of the first civilization as a beginning. So early and so isolated that it must be culturally pure. But purity is usually what later empires tell themselves when they have forgotten how messy their own birth was. Origins are almost always turbulent. The first city was likely no exception. It was not a still pond, it was a delta, and deltas are where worlds mix. Silt from mountains, salt from the sea, fresh water and tide, fishers and farmers, priests and accountants, migrants arriving with tools wrapped in reed mats and ancestors wrapped in songs. The genius of the first civilization may not have been invention from nothing. It may have been synthesis at terrifying scale. That would explain the speed. That would explain the complexity. That would explain why urban life seems to appear with a force that feels almost unnatural, as though some hidden reservoir of skills had been poured into the plane all at once. Maybe it had. But there is one final layer to the puzzle, and it is the one that keeps this story from closing neatly. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it is not omniscient. It does not whisper a direct confession. It gives patterns, probabilities, affinities, distances. It can tell us that ancestry moved. It can hint that populations mixed in unexpected ways. It can reveal that our categories were too blunt. But it cannot by itself name the drowned homeland, map the migration with perfect clarity, or tell us what those people called themselves when the shore was still dry beneath their feet. For that, we need archaeology, paleoclimate records, linguistics, mythology, and a willingness to let the old story break apart. So where does that leave us? With a city that may have been founded by the displaced, with genomes that refuse to stay in their proper boxes, with the possibility that the world's first civilization was born not from rooted certainty, but from the trauma and ingenuity of people who had already lost one world and were determined not to lose another. That would mean civilization itself began as a response to disappearance. Not a monument to stability, but a defense against collapse. And if that sounds uncomfortably modern, it should. You and I live in an age that still worships borders, still romanticizes pure origins, still tells simple stories about where cultures come from. Yet, the old urban experiment may be staring back across 5,000 years to say something deeply inconvenient. The future is often built by those who had to leave home first. The people who seem not from here may be the very people who teach a place how to survive. That is the hidden knife in this story. The first civilization may have emerged not despite migration, but because of it. Not despite environmental disruption, but through the disciplines it forced into human life. The city, in other words, may be the child of exile. And now the title starts to mean something much dark. Not from here, not from this soil, not from the stable map we inherited, not even from a world that still stands above water, a lost basin, a broken coastline, ancestors whose homes are now seabed, their fingerprints preserved not in monuments alone, but in the chemistry of teeth and the statistical grammar of a genome. They vanish physically, then return as signal, a whisper inside the data, a drowned chapter surfacing in a machine-built graph. You can almost see the moment the researchers realize it, the glow of screens in a quiet lab, the low hum of refrigeration, tables full of numbers that should have confirmed a familiar story and instead open a trapdoor beneath it. History does not explode. It tilts. And once it tilts, every textbook sentence starts sliding toward a different conclusion. So were the founders of the first civilization not from here? If by here we mean a single local population rising in splendid isolation, then maybe yes. If by here we mean the visible landscape of historical Mesopotamia, then maybe not entirely. If by here we mean the earth beneath our feet, the answer may be stranger still. They were from a version of Earth we can no longer visit except by sonar, sediment core, and imagination. That is the kind of revelation that does not end a mystery. It multiplies it. What else is underwater? What languages went silent before writing captured them? What rituals of the first cities were really memories of a coast now erased? And how many of our greatest beginnings are actually second attempts by people we have misnamed for thousands of years? Maybe the first civilization was never a clean beginning at all. Maybe it was a salvage operation, a breathtaking, organized, sacred act of rebuilding after the sea took the original blueprint. If that idea grabbed you, stay close, subscribe and follow, because next time we're going deeper into the drowned world beneath the Gulf, and the evidence there may force us to ask an even more dangerous question. What if the first Eden was not a myth, but a map?